So now that our commands are binding correctly, let's go ahead and bind to our entries and our date pickers and our picker. So what we have to do is all of these properties that we already have inside of the new expense VM need to be binding to those elements, so eventually, well, the properties change, so they have the actual value that the user is writing over there. So this is actually a bit more straightforward than doing that with commands. What we have to do, or what we can do, is for the container, in this case maybe the stack layout of certain elements, set a binding context. So I can set this to binding to a source of static resource and set it to VM. Sounds familiar? This is exactly what we said when doing the command, except this is now going to be in the binding context, which means that all of the elements inside of the container are going to have the exact same binding context. Which means that for the entry, for example, if we want the text to be binding to something, all we have to do is write the path. We no longer have to write the entire source, because the source is now going to be coming from the binding context, either from the element or, if we haven't set it in the element, from its container, which is our case. Which means now that we can bind directly to the expense name property. Just like this, a binding is going to be established. Now, by default, a binding is only from the source to the element, which means that in this case from the view model to the element. So only when the element in C# changes will this entry be updated. Now we want the other way around to happen as well. If the entry is updated, the text should be bound to the expense name and update that expense name property. Now for that to happen, all we have to do is set the mode to two-way. Notice that there are many modes available. Default, one time, one way to source, and two-way. They are pretty much self-explanatory. So it is the two-way mode, the one that we need. Something very similar is going to happen with the entry for the amount. We're going to bind the text. In this case, of course, the property is going to be another one. This is going to be the expense amount property. And we're also going to be setting the mode to two-way. So you get the idea. The other entry is going to do the same thing for the expense description. Now, the date picker doesn't have a text, but it has a date. It is the date, the one that we want to bind. And the binding is going to work in the same way. We're simply, in this case, going to be binding to the expense date and set the mode to two-way as well. The only difference is that we are not binding to a text, we are binding to a date. Now, the picker is actually a unique case for us. We do have the selected item to which we want to bind the expense category. So we can do the binding as always, but in the case of the picker, we need another thing. We still are not populating the picker. We have to bind its items to the observable collection of strings that we are actually missing inside of the new expense. So in here, we're actually going to need something very similar to what we see in the categories VM. An observable collection of categories. Of course, we will need to get the categories, which eventually are going to be binding to that picker, because the picker has to display these categories. So how to bind observable collections is something that we're going to take a look at in the next lecture. For now, let's go ahead and take a look at what is going to happen when we now select or press the Save button to insert a new item. In fact, let me go ahead and change the breakpoint all the way down here after the expense has been created. If the binding is working correctly, now expense name, expense amount, expense date and expense description, not yet the expense category because we are binding the observable collection yet, but all of these other properties should already have the value that is being written inside of all of these elements. So let's go ahead and test that out. Again, I have this breakpoint ready. After the expense has been created, we are going to inspect the values of the properties. So here I have the up and running. I'm going to navigate to the expenses tab, click add new expense, set the name of this expense, let's say coffee. Let's say that this was, by the way, right here, because I am on my computer, by default the keyboard is not there, but I could go ahead and navigate over to hardware, select keyboard and select toggle software keyboard, or just press Command K. Notice that because we set the keyboard type, we do see a numerical keyboard. Let's say that my coffee was $5. Let's just write a short description. Notice the keyboard changing. Set the date. By the way, we probably should set the date to today because this date makes no sense. Let's just go ahead and say that I bought this on January 8, 1948 for some reason. I don't have anything in this picker, but we see the picker working. Let's go ahead and click on save. We hit the breakpoint. Now let's inspect the expense and notice that now in the amount we do see that 5. The date we do see that thing 70 years ago. We see the description, the name, the coffee is by default set to 0 right now. It's going to auto increment if you remember when it's inserted into the database. So it's pretty much working very well, the binding already. We see everything already in here in the element from what we growed as users inside of the form. So I'm just going to hit on continue. So this goes ahead and is inserted, and notice that because it was inserted, we do get automatically navigated back. If it didn't insert the element, we would have seen an error message, but because it did insert it, we get navigated back. So our application is already working very well. We are already saving new expenses with the information that is coming directly from this form. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to start to bind those observable collections. So we see, first of all, our picker with some elements, some objects to be selected. And also, we should also see the expenses page, list all of these expenses. And we're going to take a little bit more time with the categories page, because in the categories page, we not only need to list expenses, we need to list them by categories and have some progress assigned to them. So in the next lecture, we're going to work on binding those observable collections so we see what we are saving in the database.